Hi, this is Andy. For those of you who are actively responsible for lean projects, you likely know about Project Management Institute, right? And their global, enduring commitment to advancing the project management profession. Well, today I'm joined by Dave Garrett, who's a senior advisor to PMI's CEO. In that role, he advises and supports decision making regarding PMI's strategy. And prior to this, Dave has previously held senior leadership roles at PMI, including Chief Strategy and Growth Office, Vice President, Corporate Development and Innovation, and Vice President of Transformation. In today's discussion, Dave will share his perspective on how projects are going beyond the traditional definitions of success like scope, time, and cost. We'll talk about topics such as value and being customer centric, but in super practical ways. And before we're done, you'll hear Dave's take on how AI will impact project managers in the years to come. It's a wide ranging discussion with a guy who has a seat at the table where the future of project management is being defined. Hey, quick note, I want to invite you to join our Lead 52 family. It's a group of global leaders who are committed to transforming our ability to lead and deliver. It's 52 weeks of leadership learning delivered right to your inbox, taking less than 5 minutes a week, and it's all for free. Learn more and sign up at getlead52.com. Thanks. Let's jump into today's discussion with Dave Garrett from the Project Management Institute. Dave, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
It's great to be here, Andy. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this. I think I first became aware of you, Dave, because of your work that's now known as projectmanagement.com. But I think back then it was called GANhead, if I remember correctly. And
It
I,
was, yeah.
yeah, I'd just be curious if you wouldn't mind. I'd love to hear a little bit more of the backstory of that site. Like, how did that come to be and why did it flourish? Like, it eventually reached millions of project managers. Give me a little bit of the backstory.
It was really, really interesting. To me, anyway.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The Gantt story. We were born out of a consulting firm. There was a small boutique consulting firm that I was a part of, and a few members of the team were as well. Actually, several of them are still with PMI today, over
Hmm,
20 years later.
nice.
It's we looked around and said, we as consultants have a great many tools and processes that we apply to our work. The external world doesn't necessarily have this.
Mhm.
Project management is a lonely role. We used to have an archetype of a project manager that we would refer to as Joe, the project manager. Joe was a very lonely guy. He was always being asked questions from above and below,
Right.
and he was doing work that was likely to be fairly unique at his organization.
Mhm,
He or she at this point,
mhm. Sure. Right.
sometimes you. And but others were doing similar work to his at other organizations, and the idea was to connect those people and get them to help advise one another, and get them writing articles over time. It started turning into webinars and that sort of thing, different media, but to compile a resource online that really helped people in a practical ways get their work done, their project work done,
Yeah.
and help them lead projects in ways that were more effective and efficient than they had in the past.
Yeah.
And it really worked out well. We developed an audience of close to 1 million before we became a part of PMI in the end of 2013. So it's been a while now that we've been with PMI, and it's been a wonderful ride there as well.
Yeah. I just love this story. It shows the hunger that people have for community and sharing good practices. And there's a lot of Joes and Josephines out there who are lonely and to find that there's a place for them. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
I mentioned your title in the intro to the episode, but how do you describe when somebody goes, "Hey, Dave, what do you do?" Like, how would you describe it?
I get involved in a lot of the key activities at the institute at this
Yeah.
point. Pierre has a number of areas that we're tackling concurrently, AI being one of them.
Mm.
I spent a lot of time over the past year on Project Success. That's been a huge project, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment.
Yeah.
And there's several other projects in the mix as well that are key to the future of the institute, the future of the profession, that are I find fascinating. I think a lot of people will as well.
Yeah. It feels to me like for as long as I've been around projects, much of the focus on some version of what they call it iron triangle, project management triangle, a triple constraint. And yet, how does a classic project like the Sydney Opera House illustrate that there's got to be more to success than just scope, schedule, and budget? And then after that, I'd love to hear how you like to define it now, since this is something you've really been studying.
Yeah, yeah. The Sydney Opera House is that classic example
Yeah.
of a project that was considered a failure for a very long time because of cost. It overran costs, it overran from a time perspective. even to a point where the public was very upset about it. The end customers were very upset about it as a waste of money. And over time, it became known as one of the more successful projects ever. You know,
Yeah.
so there's a time element to success that I don't think many people take into account.
Mhm.
Certainly not within our tight sort of project management world. You know, we think of things. Uh, we tended to think of things a while back as more of our work is more of an execution exercise,
Mm.
versus looking down the road. I think over time we've started to talk more about things like outcomes and benefits and now value in ways that are very, very constructive and get us more aligned with the way that the end customer, the public, the way that the beneficiaries of what we do perceive success. And that's really, really important. I think it brings us in alignment with businesses that are now more customer centric, just organizations that bring in the customer when they make decisions to better understand, the customer's needs, to better understand the value that that customer's expecting from whatever exercise you're engaged in.
I grew up in IT as a software developer. So, Dave, I feel like a lot of times success was, did you get it in production before end of year? Or did
Right,
you hit a
right.
date or, something like that? So, um, value is an interesting thing to talk about because I've yet to meet somebody say it's a bad idea. And yet, if you ask somebody, what do you mean by value? You get a lot of different answers. So in your mind, and I know because I've read some of your stuff, but how are you describing what value actually means now? And you got a little bit into it in that answer, but anything more on that?
Yeah, it's really value is a tricky thing to
Right.
pin down. It's funny because that's how a lot of the LinkedIn posts, start out. We've asked this to be a discussion amongst the community. So
Yeah.
people are saying, first you need to define value. And the idea that is undefined is what's actually useful about the term on a global level. You think about the diversity of projects, how different is building a bridge versus running a marketing campaign, or how
Yeah.
different is developing software to planning an event. It's just
Mhm.
the diversity of projects, the diversity of perspectives. Individual stakeholder perspectives can be different. They can assess success differently based on their past experiences, based on their knowledge, based on all the things that they know about that come together to help them make a decision. And so decisions aren't necessarily made just on hard metrics.
Right.
They're made on based on um, someone's views, perceptions rather, based on those hard metrics and based on what they think in general. Otherwise the world would be much, much more automated and a lot of us would be out of a job. Um, so
That's
perception, I
good.
think, is super important. It's on a global level, it's very, very important in terms of being understanding projects as a whole, on the whole, because of the diversity of opinion. On a local level, it's really, really important because you've got to engage with stakeholders in a way that helps them align and in a way that helps you uncover creative new ways of thinking about your project as well. Because those perceptions, you bring people who have different perceptions together, and that's how you spur creativity. That's how you spur new ideas. That's how you might end up with a slightly different view on your value proposition of your project based on one conversation with somebody who really knows a lot about X, whatever that topic is.
Yeah.
So it's not perceptions are not a bad thing. They're a really important thing for project managers to not just be aware of, but to engage with and manage.
Yeah. When I first saw the definition that used the word perceive, Dave, I come at part of what I was thinking is like, yeah, but this stakeholder is going to perceive it different from that one. It's not as scientific or data driven as we need. And
Right.
yet, in reality, let's say we had something that was, fit what my desires to be, and yet it's not perceived as value in their eyes. I could be like, hey, look, you signed off on this. We met that, and yet we're missing the perceived part. So I'm with you that it's not a cop out. It's actually more reflective of the real world, right?
It absolutely is, and its perception is also of the moment.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
talked about the Sydney Opera
right,
House and the time element of success.
yeah,
You ask here, you get a different answer than when you ask there.
hmm,
That's important to know. You think about like jets, that are being developed by here in the U.S. and the Department of Defense. And you get a lot of clamor in Congress and by the public saying, why are we building jets in this age of drones?
Mhm. Yeah.
That sort of thing is something that changed over time.
Yeah.
And if you're developing a new cancer drug, you're on a path and you're keeping one eye open to the outside world to understand how your competitors are doing. If they're trying to solve the same problem you are, maybe you do everything right and get exactly to where you want to be at exactly the time you said you were going to be there.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter because your competitor has a better product.
Mhm.
That negates all the success that you think you had based on your evaluation of your execution metrics, everything you knew, everything you had. You can only predict so much. So at the end of the day, part of that's judgment, part of that is perception,
Yeah.
and there are ways, it's interesting. I've talked about it recently in ways that just sort of bring it down to earth for your average consumer, not just project managers. Think about Amazon ratings, right?
Mhm.
We all rely on Amazon ratings, the star, 5 stars, to understand whether a product is good or not, whether it's worth the effort and expense, or not. And we've come to sort of accept that as a general perception marker that's really important. And it is. And those ratings are based on a variety of things. But because there's so many people rating it, you say, okay, well, I accept that as a marker of this being good or bad.
Mhm.
So that's one way of I think relaying the importance of perception. I mean, we all take it for granted that it's important in that particular scenario, and I think there'll
Right.
come a day when we take it for granted that it's important in the project context as well.
Yeah. I think the other part of the definition that it seems like is part of the PMI view in this is it's the value, but it also exceeded the effort and expense because something could be of value, but the cost of it was such that it wasn't worth it, right?
Right. No, absolutely. Just to take one step back, our mission, our stated mission is to maximize project success to elevate our world, right? Which I think is pretty bold. In the past, we focused more on the profession, more on project management. This is a more holistic view that says we're going to be concerned with the actual success of the projects, the perceived, we didn't say at the time perceived.
Yeah.
We had to, this project was about like, how do we measure that? How do we
Mhm.
know we're maximizing project success? How do we know uh, what a successful project looks like,
Yeah.
because, uh, you know, there's been a lot of attempts at that, but none that have been, relatively fully agreed upon,
Yeah.
across the world. So that's what we're trying to do here is define project success, understand its drivers. And at the end of the day, we found that the research indicated that our view of project success itself and what project professionals need to do to drive that success really has to be expand, really has to get broader than it was ever before. We can't just be focused on execution for all the reasons we just talked about,
Yeah.
because that really doesn't necessarily get us to success. We have to manage the perceptions of those of project stakeholders that go beyond the project sponsor, that look at the opinions of executives and the end customer, the end beneficiaries of what it is that we're producing, and understand how that might change over time as well. So,
Yeah, I seem to recall it's been a little while since I looked at the numbers for the Sydney Opera House, but I seem to recall it's something like 10 years late and 1,000% overspent, and yet
it was
it's the
something so astronomical you couldn't
yeah,
even get your
but
head
it's
around
like the icon for a city now, and to some degree a country, right? But it just goes to show that it's not as simple. But I wonder sometimes. I feel like my my love, and I'm overstating that, but the reason why I hold on to scope, time, and cost is it's often the easiest thing to measure. And so when
it.
it's
It
easy to measure, we want to hold on to it. And so this other isn't. And yet measurement's like a big deal that you found in your research. So, Dave, I think part of the reason why I hold on so tightly to scope, time, and cost is it's just to me, it's just the easiest to measure. You know? And so uh, what are some ways that people are defining or measuring or tracking success on real world projects, in the way that PMI is thinking?
Yeah, I think the measurement is very, very important. Not just measurement of perception, although that's something new and something we were emphasizing in the context of this research,
Yeah.
but localized systems of measurement. We found our research found that your project success score, and I explain project success scores in just a moment,
Yeah.
will double if you do three things. If you set goals up front, if you put in place a system of measurement that aligns and guides decision making, and if you track progress along the way, if
Hmm.
you track how your value is being delivered along the way. If you do those three things, which seem simple, they seem like mom and apple pie, we do it all the time. Uh, how is that a revelation? Only 38% of projects actually do that, right? So imagine, you take this back to your, we've got slides on this, that people will be able to use to take back to their organizations, their PMOs, and say, you know what, if we just make sure we do these three things on every project, we're going to have a huge impact on the success of the projects, the perceived success, absolutely. But whatever success markers you want to use, you're definitely going to have an impact on them by doing those three things. And I think that's critically important. That's one sort of takeaway. I always say, like, if I go to a conference or listen to something like this, if I get one key takeaway that I can take back to my organization and use in a practical way, then it's worth it. That's probably the one of the biggest takeaways from the research that you can use right away. Um, I think, and we all think we do these things, but how many projects have you seen where you're 3 months in and you're starting to think about, we really need to rethink the goals, or we really need to kind of think about the goals for the first time. And now that we're looking at the metrics and seeing that although we're measuring things that are easy to measure, those aren't necessarily the right things to measure.
Right.
Because it's not going to show us the real value that's going to emerge from the project.
I asked one client, Dave. I said, "How do you measure success in your projects?" And they said, "How much budget is left at the end of the project if we didn't spend all of our budget?" I just was like,
No, it's crazy, it's crazy.
you know,
And it's
it
not to say those things aren't important,
right.
but they're table stakes. Those the
Yeah,
iron triangle are table stakes, they're expected. It's not the end of the story,
it's not irrelevant. Yeah.
Yeah,
You mentioned the net project success score in your answer. Would you tell us a little bit more about the NPSS?
yeah, the NPSS, the Net Project Success Score, is our global measure. This isn't something that can be applied necessarily locally, although there's ways that we can look at that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Um, The Net Project Success Score is somewhat similar to NPS, Net Promoter Score. Actually, we ask people to rate their project on a scale from 0 to 10, based on the definition that we talked about earlier. Is your project on track to deliver value that is worth the effort and expense? 0 to 10, 0 being extreme disagree, and 10 being fully agree. So we took all that data back, from 10,000 people. And so based on our definition, we understood, how they rated their project. The last project they worked on is actually the way we phrased it. So we get some, a stable data set.
Right.
Um, and 0 to 6 was considered failures. 7 and 8 were considered mixed. And then 9 and 10 were considered successful. And there's a lot of reasons why we did constructed the number sets like the way that we did, but
Yeah.
it's definitely leaning towards, success really has to be a success. A success can't be just sort of a meh, in the
Yeah.
middle
Right.
sort of thing. Um, so I
Yeah.
think that
Success can't be. "Oh, I guess we just didn't suck. Right. It's got
right,
to be.
right,
It's got to be
right,
something more than that. Yeah.
absolutely. So the net project success score for this past for 2024 was 38. And so the range of possible scores would be minus 100 to positive 100. So not bad, not amazing. There's still a lot of room for success, for further success, for maximizing that, which is one of the reasons why, the main reason why PMI exists at this point, to help project managers maximize their success in a
Yeah.
collaborative way with each other and with the institute.
Yeah. I like it. You know, um, putting more focus on value implies, and actually, I think you actually stated it a couple of times, a more, I'd say, customer centric mindset as well. And so, when you think of it just in practical ways, Dave, for you, what does customer centric mean to you? And I mean, you lead initiatives at a high level. You're maybe even more of a sponsor, but how do you personally seek to be more customer centric?
It's interesting when we produce something for our customers. We want to understand the mix of the value that they see in those particular products. AI has been a huge focus lately. People have loved the sort of the training that we put together and put out there, and they love Infinity as well. But let's just take one of those training exercises that's badged. There's an element of um, will this make look good on my resume?
Mhm.
How will this affect my career? And there's an element of practical utility. Will this help me actually be better, at my
Mhm.
job?
Right.
That's another element of it. There's an element of um, what will I know that I didn't know before? Like what are the gaps in my knowledge that I'll fill, and then that will be like one puzzle piece in the whole, in the larger picture of who I am and what I deliver to my organization. There's a lot of ways that needs are expressed, and understanding those needs in a way that you can align on them and be successful at a local level, I think is really, really important. And that's how we try to understand the customer perspective today. There's a lot of things we do with sentiment analysis, so understanding reactions to things and how people are reacting online, what they're saying on LinkedIn and elsewhere about what we do. Yeah, with products and with PMI in general, we do some of that sentiment analysis. So we keep a close eye on the pulse of customers and how they're using what we produce to become better. And that goes back to the measurement bit that I was talking about, the measurement finding that I was talking about earlier. We definitely want overall for project managers to manage the expectations of their project stakeholders, understand the perceptions, manage their perceptions, and manage the expectations that result. Um, but we also want them to have local measures that are reflective of the value that their project is actually producing. So they have a data foundation, that they can base their um, alignment on. They could sort of say, that this is what matters when it comes to delivering the value that you perceive should be there.
So, Dave, one of the things that I appreciate about your approach is how do you make things sticky? How can you help us remember things? And you've got an acronym MORE. Would you tell us about that and how that can help us implement some of these ideas?
Right, right. As we work through this research, and we spent almost definitely the better part of a year on this. As we worked through this research, it became more and more evident that we needed to take a more expansive view of project success. How we understood it, how even project professionals understood it is different today than even we would have expected. We got this very tight focus on value. We've got this idea that project success is not binary. We've got this idea that managing perceptions is very, very important. Perceptions are important, and managing those perceptions are really, really important to project success because at the end of the day, perception is reality. So we came up with, we were trying to frame out how we see things changing and how project professionals might address those changes.
Mhm.
And there's more being asked of project professionals, and we could go down that road, but I think everyone's familiar with it. Um, but from a perspective of how to address it, project professionals, M stands for managed perceptions. Project professionals need to manage the perceptions of their stakeholders in order to be considered successful, or for a project to be considered successful. They need to understand how those stakeholders feel about success at every given point in time, including customer perspectives, including executive perspectives and others, how they perceive that the project's outputs provide sufficient value relative to the perceived investment of resources. So, is that project delivering value that's worth the effort and expense?
Yeah.
How does that look from all these different angles? Secondly, the O in more stands for own project success beyond project management success. So it's easy for us to say we've been successful when we've met the iron triangle criteria, where we focused on execution metrics by themselves. It gives us a very sort of tight target and a way to say, well, we were successful. I don't know what happened with the rest of it. But that's a wrong way of viewing things because although that's foundational, although execution is foundational, doing it well is foundational, the expectation of the world is much higher than that. Whether you're talking about project professionals or you're talking about executives and customers, That's not in alignment with, what they think of as project success. So it's important to own that larger picture, that big picture. The R is about change. Relentlessly assessing project parameters is what the R stands for. And the idea as you move through time, there are things in the outside world, in your ecosystem, and there are changes that happen that impact the value delivery of your project. So you're aiming for a certain place at the start of your project. Where you're aiming might have to change over time to deliver the intended value, or to deliver the value that people want today versus the value that people wanted 5 months ago. Those things change, and relentlessly reassessing what that change looks like is an important part of your job as a project professional.
Hmm.
Finally, E stands for expand perspective. And it's just that big picture view. How does your project fit into the overall strategy? How does it fit with other projects? What are the impacts that your project has on functions within the business, on other projects, on other work being done, on the outside world? Just having that sort of big picture view, and that big picture perspective of um, of how your project is not only being perceived, but the impacts it's having on others is really, really important. I think you get part of that from the engagement with stakeholders when you talk about their perceptions and what they
Mhm.
value. But there's also awareness from a project professional perspective about um, the business. For instance, if you have more business acumen, you can understand.
It's interesting. I think in some industries, it's really obvious who the customer is because there's somebody who buys the service or product directly. But I feel like sometimes on internal projects, there isn't enough clarity even of who is our customer. And thinking about that, the terminology is not as obvious. So I feel like your focus on customer centric is going to force us to think about, well, who is our customer, and are we spending time with the customer, or is it just the persona that we're thinking about? Are we actually spending time with them? And I think you're going to drive good behavior, or productive behavior, by putting such focus on that.
Yeah, I think that, you'd be surprised. I interact with a lot of people at a lot of different professional societies, trade associations, that sort of thing. I've been a part of councils around, various topics and that sort of thing. If you ask these folks, executives that are leading these sort of organizations, who is your most important customer? There's many times when they get confused and they can't necessarily name that person.
Right.
Even though you're heading up a professional society, targeting a specific group, is it just, is it these people or is it those people?
Mm.
And talking that through is so very important to delivering value.
Yeah.
Value to whom?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. You mentioned AI before, and there's the phrase that says AI won't take your job. Someone using AI will take your job. And in what ways do you see that, at least in some ways, applying to people leading projects? And I'm just curious on what your view, not rear view mirror, but forward looking, like PMI is really trying to do, about AI impacting project managers in the coming years.
yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting research we've done from a thought leadership perspective recently on AI. It's all very forward looking, more forward looking than we've ever been as the Institute. In the last year and a half, 2 years, it's a night and day difference,
Mm.
between what we've done in the past and what we're doing today from a thought leadership perspective. Um, there's a lot to digest there. We've looked at how adoption rates have changed over the last year and a half, and obviously there's a lot more of adoption, and how these things are being used. How are AI tools assisting you? How are they automating what you're doing? How are they augmenting your work and augmenting you as a professional? And we're seeing, there has been a lot of automation using traditional AI, but when you're looking at generative AI specifically, most of it's augmentation. Most of
Mm.
it is accelerating your work, but in a way where you have to be an active participant in that, an active leader in that. You can get a lot of you can give it a list of things that you've thought of and ask what's missing, and boom, there you have it. You have a measly list of your of what you needed. You have ways of accelerating brainstorming activities. You can generate a mind map around a specific topic and start with something that's solid and tangible and make everyone into an editor instead of somebody has to originally,
Right.
create something. So you start at a place where you would have been after an hour and a half of work with a group, and you end up with much more refined output, from that. So, um, and we talk a lot about, um, there's been a lot of talk in the industry about automation to the degree that, more things will be automated, therefore people will have more time. Project professionals will have more time to do interacting with those project stakeholders, managing those perceptions, doing a lot of the work that is time intensive and human intensive. That's it's really really hard to be done by a machine, and I think that's true. Some of the
Yeah.
things I just described
Hmm.
can be time savers as well as making you better,
Yeah.
and also improve your work life balance. Which is something we're all concerned with. You can sort of manage that a little bit better if you can do the kind of duller tasks a little bit easier.
Hmm.
The grunt work a little bit easier, not so much grinding. You're more focusing on the human interaction, which is really going to get you to a better place. So,
At least one of your articles or blog posts talked about the first mover's advantage, and I think that's a good thing for us to be thinking about. People listening. It's easy to sit back and go, "No, the hardest part of my job is dealing with cranky stakeholders, and AI is never going to be able to do that." And so they don't engage because they do see that there are limitations to what I can do. But would you mind mentioning that first mover's advantage of how that could apply to us?
yeah, absolutely. The First Mover's Advantage is a really great report. It's a good one to look at as an individual project professional and also from an organizational perspective. We talk about things like trailblazers. There are people who use AI on most of their work. I'll put it that way. And how it impacts their work and what the differences that it makes. I think that's an important perspective from an individual's angle.
Hmm.
Then from an organizational angle, we talk about the importance of leadership and how leaders being fully engaged in AI efforts, guiding, helping create opportunities for people, specific opportunities for people to be successful using AI is really important. Use cases are particularly important. Understanding often people are afraid to use it because they just don't know how.
Yeah.
It's like you look at ChatGPT, it's just like a command line interface. It's like what do I do with that? I don't know. I'll try to treat it like Google. I'll search for stuff and
Yeah.
you kind of go through some winding road that ends up with a poem or something like that. And you say fine, you walk away.
Yeah. Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so it's not complicated on the face of it, but it's very complicated in terms of applicability for some people because they've got a way of doing things that they're kind of used to doing them, and then it doesn't include AI. And how do I include AI in that process is a huge question for them. That they assume it's just not going to get it done any faster than just doing what I've always done, and they don't dive in to try. So what we're trying to do is combine thought leadership that sort of tells our community, this is how these things are being applied and by whom, and then we have training in our most recent training class, guides you through use cases of practical use cases where you can actually apply the AI to the everyday work of a project manager, and it'll tell you step by step what you need to do to make things happen a lot more quickly and make you a better project manager along the way. So I
Yeah.
think that application is super important, and understanding what others are doing from a thought leadership perspective is also, equally important. The two together are just very, very powerful, and we're
Yeah.
getting wonderful feedback on all of it. So
Yeah. It's one of those things you kind of don't know until you know, right? And I feel like one of the best antidotes for anxiety is action and taking action of taking advantage of tools like that, seeing what it can do and stretching you. And all of a sudden you realize, oh, actually, I feel like one of the things that helps me is you realize what it's not good at, right? You
yeah,
can find out what it's good at, but also what it's not so good at least yet.
yeah, and you know what? Creativity is born out of failure and a
Yeah.
lot of things that people and machines are not so good at. And you think about the hallucination bit, and that's another sort of, I don't want to call it a cop out because it's a legitimate concern. But a lot of times people will say, "Oh, I don't want to use those things. They're always wrong." They're just they come up with nothing but wrong answers, or you can't tell when it's wrong or right, which I think is a different problem. But um, that ability to hallucinate, that ability to sort of come up with different responses every time you hit refresh, on you asked for it to cycle through again and try again.
Yeah.
Um, that's going to spur ideas, not for just from you, but from team members you work with around how you might do your work a little bit better.
Mm.
It's there's fresh ideas, fresh perspectives is helpful. You just have to take them as perspectives in the same way you would take advice from a friend, who's working right next door to you, or just any human being. You're going to get some things that are right, some things that are wrong, and somehow in the mix, you're going to have to identify the best things to apply and make that happen. So
Yeah.
it's hallucination is not a bad thing. It's just a thing. It is
Yeah.
helps you understand how to work with the tool. You don't
Mhm.
work with it like you do a calculator. It's different.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know.
for sure. I kind of like the metaphor of it's like an intern. Like you don't get upset at an intern if they don't get it perfect, right? But they got the first draft for you, like you said, an editor instead of a creator. And I also try to remember, Dave, this is the stupidest they'll ever be. I don't know if that's proper English, but they're only going to keep getting better. So that's why we keep experimenting. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the pace at which they're getting better is incredible.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
you know,
it's so exciting, really. Yeah. So beyond anything we've talked about, can you think of some resources from PMI that maybe relatively new that our listeners might not know about currently, but might want to look into?
absolutely. There are lots and lots of we have several thought leadership research reports that are um, particularly useful. The training itself has actually been a real highlight within the AI space. We've got a generative AI overview for project managers. We have a data landscape of it, generative AI for project managers. That's been an interesting topic because
Mm.
the importance of solid data to artificial intelligence is something that not everyone understands on the project in the project management world.
And there's the privacy side of that then too.
Absolutely,
Yeah, yeah,
absolutely. Like what can you put into these things and not put into these things, and um, what do your concerns have to be relative to the data when you're talking about generative AI?
yeah,
Um, Talking to AI is another bit of both research and training that we offer. It's essentially prompt engineering for project managers. That gives you a really good sense of how to interact with the tools. And then finally, practical application of generative AI for project managers is a training class that is use case driven. And we're just getting rave reviews over this, 10 out of 10 across the board
yeah,
for the first couple of weeks at least. This just came out recently. It offers you a set of really practical use cases that help you not just understand prompting techniques better, but understand them in the context of workflows that are common within project management scenarios. So it's like, when do you use this, and how do you use it in that context?
yeah,
Super, super important to project professionals. And of course, there's our AI-powered learning co-pilot, which we call Infinity. This is evolving into, that got more guided experiences now that sort of help step you through addressing challenges that you're having with implementing AI at your organization within the project management context. It just helps you do your work in more effective and efficient ways. And a lot of all of the actual content that Copilot or Copilot Infinity accesses is PMI vetted and PMI community vetted. So, experts within PMI have vetted a lot of the underlying content, or consumers of that content, people in the community, have vetted that content and rated it highly. So this isn't just going out to the world and saying, how do I do X? This
yeah,
is going out to a group of experts and fellow practitioners and asking them the same question. So you get a slightly different result, hopefully a better result
yeah,
in almost every case.
yeah, yeah,
So those are a few things I'd like to highlight really quick, and I think they'd be really good investments of people's time to
yeah.
look into.
That's good. I appreciate you walking through that. It's helpful. What you're trying to do is remind us of how do we implement these ideas so we can start making the impact. Well, I got to tell you, for those listening, Dave has given us plenty of things to think about here. I put links in the show notes that if you'd like to learn more about what he's referred to in the discussion, check that out. Hey, Dave, thank you so much for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
It's been great to be here, Andy. Thank you.